I want to be precise about what I saw. I was there for all of it. I am telling you now, 11 years later, because I still think about it most mornings, in the particular way you think about things that rearranged something fundamental in how you understood the universe. My name is Vrethkaz. I am Keth Valorin. If you are unfamiliar with my species, we are tall, chitin-plated, pack-organized, and we assign rank almost entirely by mass and threat profile. An adult Keth Valorin cadet stands between 2.1 and 2.4 meters. I was on the smaller end at 2.2. I weighed, at the time of these events, approximately 214 kilograms without armor. I mention this not to impress you. I mention it because it is the context without which nothing else in this account makes sense. The Academy was HFY Valor. If you know anything about multi-species military institutions in the conquered sphere, you know the name. 1,100 cadets at any given intake cycle, drawn from 31 member species. The faculty was largely Veth Valoran and Keth Morian, long-standing institutional lineages, but the student body was genuinely mixed. Insectoid species, aquatic adapted species, crystalline cognition species, carbon analogs. A full taxonomy of sapient life, all attempting to learn the same things about tactics, endurance, and cohesion under pressure. And then in the intake cycle I am describing, there were 2 humans. I had not encountered humans before HFY Valor. I had read the standard issue Conquered Species Primer, which devoted approximately 4 paragraphs to humanity and noted, among other things, that they were bilaterally symmetrical, endothermic carbon-based organisms of the primate suborder, that their homeworld was a Class M terrestrial body designated Earth, that they had achieved conquered-recognized sapient status in the standard period, and that their physical parameters were moderate across all assessed threat vectors. Moderate, that was the word. I had also looked at the physiological appendix, which included standardized measurement ranges for member species. Humans came in between 1.5 and 1.9 meters in height. They weighed between 50 and 100 kilograms. They had no exoskeleton, no secondary musculature clusters, no venom apparatus, no electroreceptive organs, no thermal shielding. Their visual range was narrow. Their auditory range was moderate. Their olfactory sensitivity was, by multi-species standards, essentially vestigial. Moderate, moderate, moderate. When the intake manifest was distributed 3 days before the cycle began, I read the human entries with the kind of abstract curiosity you extend to something that is technically the same category of thing as you but clearly not. 2 humans, 1 male, 1 female. The male was listed at 1.82 meters and 81 kilograms. The female was listed at 1.57 meters and 51 kilograms. 51 kilograms. I weighed 51 kilograms when I was 4 years old. I remember reading that entry twice and then setting down the manifest and not thinking about it further. There was nothing to think about. 51 kilograms at 1.57 meters. The primer said moderate. The appendix said the numbers. The numbers said what they said. Her name was Sable Oren. I learned this on the first morning at intake formation. We were assembled in the primary yard, a vast flat expanse of HFY Valor's compressed mineral surface, surrounded on 3 sides by the Academy's main structure, and open to the sky on the 4th. The sky was the particular gray-violet of HFY Valor's early morning, which is a color I have never seen anywhere else in the conquered sphere, and which I still find, in memory, oddly beautiful. 1,100 cadets, 31 species, 2 humans. I was in the 3rd rank from the front. I could see clearly because I was tall even for a Keth Valorin. I watched the formation assemble and did what you do on the first morning of a military intake. I assessed. The male human, I noted, was near the back of the formation in the human standard weight cluster. He looked like what the primer had suggested, unremarkable, moderate, bilateral. He had brown hair and a posture that was neither poor nor distinguished. And then I found the female human, and I understood at a cellular level why she had been placed where she had been placed. She was at the very front of the formation. This was not by accident. The formation had been arranged, as intake formations at HFY Valor traditionally were, by descending threat classification score. The largest, heaviest, most threat-assessed cadets at the back. The smallest, lowest scored at the front. Sable Orin was in the front row, third from the left, surrounded by species I cannot now name individually but which were all, relative to her, either larger by a significant margin, or assessed as higher threat despite comparable physical scale. She was very small. I had known the number 51 kilograms, but a number is not a thing you see. She was 1.57 meters and 51 kilograms, and standing in the front row of an alien military academy intake formation. And she looked, and I say this with neither cruelty nor condescension, because I am trying to be precise. She looked like something that had been put there by mistake. She was also standing completely still. Not the rigid, anxious stillness of someone trying to look impressive. The easy, habituated stillness of someone who was comfortable being where they were. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was level. Her eyes, I could see even from the third rank that her eyes were moving slowly, systematically, across the yard. Not anxious scanning. Assessment. I noted that. And then the formation call sounded, and intake began, and I stopped thinking about her. The first week at HFY Valor is what the faculty called orientation. What cadets called it was considerably less polite, but the formal designation was orientation, and what it consisted of was a structured sequence of stress introduction scenarios designed to establish baseline performance metrics for each cadet, expose fault lines in assumption and preparation, and begin the long process of breaking down species-specific instinct hierarchies in favor of unit cohesion. They also, less formally, established the social order. This is not unique to HFY Valor. I understand it is not unique to military institutions. You put 1,100 organisms together for the first time and give them a shared context of stress, and they will, within approximately 72 hours, establish a working hierarchy. They cannot help it. It is what social sapients do. At HFY Valor, the hierarchy that emerged in that first week was, broadly speaking, one that mirrored the threat classification scores. The species that were large, strong, fast, well-armored, or possessed of notable offensive capability occupied the upper tier. The species that were smaller, less physically imposing, or carried lower threat scores occupied the lower tier. This was not, at HFY Valor, an especially brutal hierarchy. There was no sanctioned cruelty. But there was a clear and visible taxonomy of status, and that taxonomy expressed itself in 100 small daily ways. Who got first access to equipment, whose opinions were solicited first during briefings, who was deferred to in corridor bottlenecks, who was laughed at. Sable Orin was, during that first week, laughed at. I want to be clear about what I mean. I do not mean she was the target of malice. I mean that when she walked into a room, something shifted in the ambient mood that was recognizable, across species, as amusement. When she spoke in a briefing, and she spoke rarely, but when she did, she spoke with the flat economy of someone who had thought carefully about what she was going to say. There was a pause before anyone responded that was about a half-second too long. When her name was called in formation, and she stepped forward, there was a sound that was not quite laughter but was adjacent to it. I know because I heard it. I know because I made it. Not loudly, not meanly, just involuntarily. The way you exhale when something is faintly absurd. 51 kilograms at a military academy. She was theoretically in the same intake as Gorakshen. And this is where I should introduce Gorakshen, because nothing that followed makes any sense without them. Gorakshen was Vethoron. If you are unfamiliar with the Vethoron, they are, by most multi-species assessments, the most physically formidable sapient species currently participating in the Concord. They are not the largest. There are species with greater raw mass. They are not the fastest, in purely mechanical terms. But the Vethoron threat classification takes into account a combination of factors that no other species matches across the board. Apex predator evolution, dual musculature systems, reflexes that benchmark in the 97th percentile of measured sapient response times, and a social cognition architecture built almost entirely around the identification and assessment of threat. The Vethoron do not have a word for prey in the sense of a class of thing that is not also a potential threat. Everything that moves is, to the Vethoron instinctual framework, assessed first. Every time, without pause. It is not aggression. It is simply how they are built. Gorakshen was 2.4 meters tall and weighed approximately 412 kilograms at intake. They had the Vethoron secondary shoulder joint that allows their upper limbs to rotate through 340 degrees. Their threat classification score was the highest in the intake cohort, by a margin that the faculty, I later learned, had not seen in 9 years. They spoke rarely. When they moved through the academy, other cadets, large cadets, species who were not accustomed to moving out of anyone's way, moved out of their way without quite being aware they were doing it. It was not intimidation in any deliberate sense. It was simply presence. The Vethoron carried their assessment constantly, visibly, in every movement, and organisms evolved to recognize predator presence, felt it, and responded to it without consulting their higher reasoning. I felt it. Every time Gorakshen entered a room I was in, something in my hindbrain quietly noted, there. The largest threat in the space is there. Adjust accordingly. Gorakshen spoke to almost no one in that first week. They moved through orientation with the untroubled economy of a being for whom nothing in the environment represented a meaningful obstacle. In briefings, they listened without expression. In physical assessments, they performed. In formation, they stood. I do not know when they first noticed Sable Orin. I know when I noticed that they had noticed. It was the 5th day of orientation. We were on the outer training circuit, the section of HFY Valor's grounds that extended past the main facility into what the faculty called the unimproved terrain sector, and what cadets called, in the argot that had already emerged, the wreck. The wreck was exactly what it sounded like, a multi-kilometer stretch of genuinely hostile landscape that the Academy had acquired specifically for its hostile qualities. Uneven surface, significant elevation change, atmospheric pockets. HFY Valor had localized weather patterns that created sudden pressure and visibility shifts, narrow traversal points, unstable sections. The 5th day assessment was a navigation exercise. Pairs, assigned randomly by the intake algorithm. Objective: reach a designated point across the wreck within a set time window, using the equipment provided. I was paired with a Kethmorian cadet named Asen Vale. We were, by any reasonable assessment, a functional pair, compatible communication protocols, complementary sensory strengths, roughly comparable physical parameters. We did fine. We reached the point with 7 minutes to spare. I am not telling you about my navigation exercise. I am telling you about Sable Orin's. She had been paired by the algorithm with a Vethkaloran cadet named HFY Narration. HFY Narration was approximately 1.9 meters tall and weighed around 140 kilograms, and was possessed of the Vethkaloran secondary sensory cluster, a specialized olfactory system that could track atmospheric composition changes with significant precision. He was, in the assessment of most of the cohort, a genuinely capable cadet. He was also, on the 5th day, struggling. I saw this because my pair had reached our designated point early and we were waiting, and the designated point happened to provide a sight line across a significant portion of the wreck's midsection. I could see, at distance, the movement patterns of several cadet pairs. I could see HFY Narration. He was moving with the particular quality of motion that indicates a sensory overload situation, slightly too deliberate, slightly too slow, compensating for something. HFY Valor's wreck had a specific characteristic that the faculty had, I later understood, deliberately not mentioned in the briefing. The atmospheric pocket activity produced sense signature interference. For species with high olfactory sensitivity, the wreck was not a navigational asset, it was a navigational liability. The same sensitivity that would have been an advantage in stable conditions became a source of contradictory, disorienting data in the wreck's interference zones. HFY's secondary sensory cluster was, in the wreck, actively misleading him. He was tracking atmospheric data that was wrong. He didn't know it was wrong, which was worse. And beside him, Sable Orin was moving. She was moving with the same easy, habituated quality I had noted in intake formation. She had a small device in her hand, the navigation equipment that had been issued to all pairs, but she was not looking at it. She was looking at the ground. I watched her for approximately 4 minutes from my position at the designated point. In those 4 minutes, she stopped twice. Both times she crouched, dropped fully to one knee on the uneven surface with no apparent concern for the awkwardness of the position, and touched the ground. She picked up a small piece of surface material each time, looked at it, replaced it. She checked a formation of surface stones. She looked at the sky, not scanning, looking at a specific point. She looked at the way the light was hitting the ridge to the northeast. Then she said something to HFY, and they changed direction. They reached the designated point with 3 minutes to spare. I know these times because I was still there when they arrived. HFY looked like someone who had been told, mid-race, that the map he had been running toward was rotated 90 degrees. Not embarrassed, genuinely recalibrating. He kept looking at Sable Orin with the expression of a being who has discovered that the tool they dismissed as ornamental has just performed a function they cannot explain. Sable Orin looked like someone who had navigated across familiar terrain, calm, slightly dusty. She noted that I was there, and she gave me a brief nod that I did not understand the register of at the time, not friendly, not unfriendly, simply acknowledging, and then she and HFY went to log their completion. And behind them, at the ridge that overlooked the wreck's midsection, I saw Galaxies standing. They had reached their designated point considerably earlier. I knew this because Galaxies moved through terrain like terrain was a formality. They should have been on their way back to the main facility. Instead, they were standing at the ridge, and they were watching the space where Sable Orin and HFY had already moved on from. Galaxies' assessment posture, the particular arrangement of the Vethoron upper body that indicates that the threat evaluation system is actively engaged, was directed at the empty ground where Sable Orin had crouched and read the stones and changed their route. I do not know what they were thinking. I do not know what they were calculating. I know that they stood there for approximately 2 minutes, which is a long time for a Vethoron to stand still while looking at something that is no longer there. Then they turned and walked back toward the facility. I did not tell anyone what I had seen. I am not sure why. Perhaps because I did not understand it well enough to articulate it. Perhaps because the story, as I understood it at the time, did not have a clear shape. It was just, Sable Orin navigated competently. Galaxies watched the place where she had been. Neither of those things individually was remarkable enough to report. The week continued. Sable Orin remained at the bottom of the informal hierarchy. The amusement that her presence provoked remained low-level and ambient. She was not disliked. She was simply underweighted, in every sense. I noticed during that week that she ate alone, not because she was excluded. There was no formal exclusion, but because no one sought her out. She had a table she used at the end of the secondary refectory, and she sat there with her food and what appeared to be a small personal notebook, and she wrote in it, and she was entirely unbothered by eating alone. The human male cadet, I have not mentioned him. His name was Tev Arnault, and he was a solid, unspectacular cadet who made no particular impression in any direction, had found a social cluster by the third day. He was eating with a mixed species group by day 4. He seemed comfortable. He did not particularly seek out Sable Oren. She seemed not to notice or care. She sat at her table and wrote in her notebook and ate her food, and occasionally looked up at the refectory around her with the same systematic, unhurried quality of attention I had seen in formation and in the wreck. On the 6th day, Gorakshin sat down at her table. I was not there when it happened. I heard about it approximately 40 minutes later from Asen Vale, who had been in the refectory and had witnessed it. Here is what Asen Vale told me. Gorakshin had come through the refectory line with their food, as they did every meal. They had moved to their usual table, a corner table that no other cadets used, partly because it was a corner table and Gorakshin occupied it, and partly because the area around any table Gorakshin occupied developed a natural vacancy. They had set down their tray, they had looked across the refectory, they had picked up their tray again. They had walked across the refectory to the end of the secondary row where Sable Oren was sitting alone with her notebook. They had set down their tray on the opposite side of the table. They had sat down. Asen Vale said the sound in the refectory changed. Not dramatically, but there was a quality of silence shift, the kind where people don't stop talking but they talk slightly more quietly and orient their attention in a particular direction without quite acknowledging that they are doing it. Sable Oren, according to Asen Vale, had looked up from her notebook, looked at Gorakshin and said something. Short, 1 or 2 words. Gorakshin had said something back, also short. And then they had both eaten their food, and Gorakshin had sat there for the entirety of the meal period, and at the end of the meal period they had picked up their tray and left, and Sable Oren had returned to her notebook. That was the entirety of what Asen Vale could report, because he had not been close enough to hear what was said, and he had not wanted to move closer and be seen to be monitoring the situation, which was, he said, the sort of thing that felt instinctively inadvisable. I asked what she had said when Gorakshin sat down. He said, I think she said hello. I thought about that for a long time. Not because hello is a remarkable thing to say when someone sits across from you. It is, in fact, the most unremarkable thing you can say. It is the minimum acknowledgement. It conveys nothing except, I see you and I am not alarmed by you. But Sable Oren had said it to Gorakshin, to 412 kilograms of Vethoron apex predator, who had walked across an alien military academy refectory and sat down uninvited at her table, and she had looked up and said hello as if this were completely ordinary. The Vethoron assessment system, I should note, is not simply a threat evaluation mechanism. It is also a recognition mechanism. The Vethoron, whose entire social cognition evolved in a context where they were the most dangerous thing in any environment, have no instinctive reference point for encountering something scarier than themselves. What their assessment system looks for instead, beyond threat, is competence, awareness, the specific quality of an organism that knows where it is and what is around it and is not running any kind of threat compensation behavior. Humans, I later learned, were extremely poor at convincing their bodies to fake non-threat behavior. Many species can perform a kind of calm. They can arrange their posture and expressions to communicate ease that their internal state does not match. Humans, under genuine threat-level stress, produced tells that the Vethoron assessment system read easily and immediately. Sable Oren had said hello to Gorakshin with complete and genuine calm. Not brave calm, not suppressed fear calm, just calm, the way you are calm about things that don't alarm you. I did not know at the time what the Vethoron assessment system made of that. I learned later. The 3-week endurance assessment was the event around which orientation culminated. It was not a single trial. It was a continuous, evolving scenario that ran for 21 days across the full extent of HFY Valor's training grounds, including the wreck and several sectors that made the wreck look like a pleasant walking path. The parameters changed daily. The faculty could and did alter conditions with no notice. Environmental shifts, objective changes, equipment restrictions. The point was not to test any specific skill. The point was to test everything simultaneously under conditions that degraded your capacity to perform it. The endurance assessment was not ranked during the event. You either completed it, meaning you reached the end of the 21 days still functionally intact and capable of performing at minimum standard, or you did not. Approximately 20% of any given intake did not, in a typical cycle. The standard expectation, I should note, was that the lower threat-assessed cadets were more likely to fall into the 20%, not as a rule, but as a statistical tendency. The correlation was not perfect, but it existed, and it was well known, and it was part of the ambient assumption structure that the intake cohort carried into the event. The assumption about Sable Orin was not subtle. I heard it stated, across the week before the assessment began, in various species languages with various specific inflections, but with essentially the same content. She wouldn't make it through the first week. I did not say this, but I thought it. I am telling you because I said I wanted to be precise, and that means not omitting the things that make me look worse. Gorakshen ate with Sable Orin every meal for the week before the endurance assessment began. This was noted. This was talked about. The talking was careful. No one in the intake cohort was foolish enough to talk about Gorakshen in any way that might reach Gorakshen, but it was happening. The consensus, as best as I could read it, was that Gorakshen had developed some kind of species curiosity about the human, the way you might be curious about an unusual rock formation. It would resolve when the endurance assessment began and the human fell out, as the human would fall out, and things would return to normal. I was not sure I believed this, but I couldn't articulate why. On the first day of the endurance assessment, we were distributed across the training grounds in 4-person units. The unit compositions had been assigned by the faculty, again by algorithm. I was in a unit with Asen Vale, a Kethmorian named Vethashan, and a HFY Valoran named Rak Tevin. Sable Orin was in a unit with Gorakshen. I found this out because the unit assignments were posted, and when I scanned the list, I found both of their names in the same unit, and I stopped and read the entry 3 times because it seemed like an error. Gorakshen and Sable Orin were assigned to Unit 12, along with a Veth Kaloran named Shenasen and a Kethmorian named Rav Teal. I don't know if the algorithm was random. I don't know if someone had intervened. I know that Unit 12 existed, and that Gorakshen and Sable Orin were in it, and that on the first morning of the endurance assessment they were standing together in the primary yard at 4:40 in the local morning with their equipment, waiting for the first objective to be distributed. I saw them across the yard. I was with my own unit. The light was the gray-violet pre-dawn, and the yard was full of cadets and equipment, and the particular tightly coiled atmosphere of a large group of people about to be subjected to something difficult. Sable Orin was standing beside Gorakshen. The contrast in their physical scales was, in that light, something I will not attempt to fully describe. It was simply very large and very small, and the very large thing and the very small thing were standing together with the ease of 2 beings who had established some kind of mutual orientation, and neither of them was looking at the other. They were both looking at the distribution points where the objectives would be released, but there was an adjacency to their positioning that was clearly chosen rather than accidental. The objectives were released, the units moved out. I cannot tell you what happened inside Unit 12 over the following 21 days as a matter of direct observation. I can tell you what I know from what I witnessed on the days our units were in proximity on the grounds, what Shenasen told me afterward, What Rav Teal wrote in the debrief summary that was circulated to the full cohort as a training document. I will try to be accurate and to flag what is second-hand. The first 3 days, Unit 12 operated in the northern sector of the training grounds, a high-elevation zone with significant cold weather exposure and difficult vertical terrain. Gorakshen performed at the level that no one found surprising. Shenasan and Rav Teal performed competently. Sable Oren, according to Shenasan, was the slowest on vertical ascent. Her mass-to-muscle ratio on climbing was not competitive with any of the other unit members, but she was not the unit's bottleneck because the objectives did not require speed on vertical ascent. They required navigation. On day 2, when the unit's objective shifted to a location that was not on any of the mapping resources they had been given, and the atmospheric conditions had degraded the electronic navigation to approximately 40% reliability, Sable Oren had looked at the terrain for a while and said that she thought the objective was probably northeast, behind the third ridgeline, because of the way the water drainage was flowing in the surface channels and the species of lichen on the southern faces of the rocks. They went northeast. The objective was behind the third ridgeline. Shenasan told me. I didn't ask her how she knew. I was too busy writing down that she had known. On day 7, I was in proximity to Unit 12 for approximately 4 hours. Our units were operating in the same sector, the Rex far western extension, with different objectives that happened to route us through adjacent terrain. I saw Sable Oren moving through the wreck. I want to describe this carefully. I said she was slow on vertical ascent, and this was true. I said she was 51 kilograms and 1.57 meters, and this was true. What I had not fully understood, watching her from a distance on day 5 of orientation, was what she was doing when she moved through complicated terrain. She was reading it, continuously. She was reading the ground ahead of her the way you read a text, not in a single glance, but in the structured accumulation of detail that builds into meaning. She was looking at where water had been. She was looking at the compression patterns on the surface. She was looking at vegetation distribution. She was looking at the sky not as sky, but as information about what was happening in the atmosphere above the terrain she was moving through. There is a Keth Valoran term for the kind of awareness I am describing, vrethkaz, which my name is derived from, and which means roughly, the one who tracks correctly. It is the quality you train for in pack hunting contexts. You look at the ground ahead not as surface to cross, but as a record of everything that has moved across it and everything that has changed it. You read the negative space, the absence of things that should be there, the presence of things that shouldn't, as much as you read the positive evidence. A Keth Valoran hunter doing this well looks unhurried and methodical, like someone reading a complex document at a comfortable pace, not because they are slow, because they are not wasting motion on incorrect hypotheses. That is what Sable Oren looked like, moving through the wreck's western extension on day 7, in species-typical terrain conditions that were, by any reasonable metric, well outside her physical performance envelope. She looked like someone reading a document they understood. She was not moving fast, but she was never moving wrong. Every step she placed was placed with the particular quality of a foot that knows exactly where it is going before it arrives. No wasted correction, no stumble and recover. On difficult surface, and the wreck's western extension had extremely difficult surface, she moved like someone reading a sentence aloud, measured exact, each word placed where it belonged. I have done a significant amount of difficult terrain work in my career since HFY Valor. I have been on multi-species units with specialists in every navigational discipline the Concord trains. I have never seen anyone read ground the way Sable Oren read it. Gorakshen, I noticed, was watching her, moving behind her and to her left, not following exactly. They were moving on their own trajectory, but with the slight adjustment in orientation that indicated their assessment system was running on something. Their upper limbs were in the secondary carry position, which I had learned by then was the Vethoron posture for moving through terrain they consider threat complex but manageable. Their head was tracking forward, as it should be. But every 20 or 30 seconds, their attention swung left to where Sable Orin was moving. Not checking on her. That is not the right way to describe it. Watching her. The way you watch something that is doing something you find interesting and are trying to understand. Day 12. There was a weather event. HFY Valor's atmospheric systems produced, over the course of about 2 hours in the mid-afternoon, a combination of pressure drop and visibility reduction that the faculty had apparently been waiting to exploit. Because approximately 40 minutes into the event, the objective parameters changed for every unit in the field simultaneously. The new objective was a rendezvous point in the southern sector. We had not been given the southern sector's terrain mapping. We were 3 hours away from it in good conditions. The visibility had dropped to approximately 6 meters. This was, to be direct, a very hard problem. HFY Valor's southern sector is not gentle terrain under good conditions. In a visibility event with changed parameters and no mapping, it was the kind of problem that cost 20% of intakes their completion. The particular difficulty was this. Most navigational systems in use across conquered member species rely on some combination of landmark identification, atmospheric sensing, electromagnetic orientation, and instrument-assisted dead reckoning. In normal conditions, the redundancy between these systems provides a robust navigational capability even when one or two systems degrade. In the southern sector's visibility event, the atmospheric sensing was producing the same interference we had seen in the wreck. The localized pressure patterns were generating false data for any species relying on differential pressure as a navigational input, which was most species. The electromagnetic instruments were also partially compromised. HFY Valor's southern sector sits over a subsurface mineral concentration that interferes with standard band electromagnetic navigation. Landmark identification was obviously compromised by the visibility reduction. Dead reckoning, without reliable landmarks to reference, accumulates error over distance. We were, in other words, being asked to navigate unfamiliar, difficult terrain under conditions specifically designed to degrade the navigational systems our species had evolved or developed. I want to say we found a good solution. We found a workable solution. Ossenvale's atmospheric sensitivity was compromised, but he had enough residual function to detect the gross pressure gradient toward the low-pressure system that the weather event had created, and we used that gradient as a rough directional reference, accepting significant error and correcting as we went. We were slow, and we made 2 wrong turns that cost us time we didn't have to spare. My unit struggled. I will not go into the details, but we got through it with about an hour of margin, and it was not a comfortable hour. I was at the rendezvous point when Unit 12 arrived. They arrived with 45 minutes of margin. Not everyone who arrived had 45 minutes of margin. I watched them come in out of the reduced visibility, the 4 of them, Gorak Shen and Sable Orin and Shen Asen and Rav Teal, and I watched the particular quality of the way they moved together, which was different from how my unit had moved together across the same hours. My unit had been 4 individuals cooperating under pressure. Unit 12 moved like a unit. There was a coherence to their spacing and pacing and direction checks that was clearly habituated rather than performed. Sable Orin was in the front. Not because she was leading in any formal sense. Gorak Shen outranked everyone in the unit by threat classification, and in the Vethoron operational framework that typically meant front of formation. Gorak Shen was not in the front. Sable Orin was in the front. She was still reading the ground. Gorak Shen was behind her and to her left, second in the formation. Their assessment posture was not threat mode. It was, I looked at this for a while before I found the right designation, escort mode. The Vethoron posture for moving through terrain while protecting something important. I filed that away. I didn't know what it meant yet. Day 18. 3 days from the end, the attrition had happened. Of the 1,100 cadets who had started, approximately 220 had fallen out, some by formal withdrawal, some by medical removal, some by failing to reach objectives in the time window and being administratively removed from the scenario. The 220 were not in the field anymore. The remaining 880 were tired in the specific way that 21-day multi-environment endurance events make you tired. Not sleepily tired, not painfully tired, but ground-down tired, the tiredness that lives in your joints and your decision-making, and the part of your brain that normally generates optimism. Day 18's objective was the worst one. I say this as someone who survived it. The faculty introduced it at 2 in the morning. A full-scale simulated breach scenario, multi-unit coordination, live environment, 4-hour window, and the terrain it ran across included everything we had seen over the previous 18 days and some things we hadn't seen before. I am not going to describe every unit's performance in Day 18. I am going to tell you what happened in the central coordination sector at approximately hour 3 of the scenario. The scenario had 3 units in a convergence position, a section of terrain that multiple units needed to move through simultaneously, which in a live scenario creates the specific problem of coordinating movement across a space that multiple groups are trying to use at the same time. My unit was one of the 3. Unit 12 was another. The convergence point had a problem. One of the traversal routes, the wide one, the one with adequate capacity for multiple units to move through, had become impassable. I don't know exactly what happened. I wasn't at the point of failure. What I know is that when my unit arrived at the convergence point, the wide route was not viable. The only viable route was a narrow traverse along the western face of a ridge. The ridge face was unstable. You could move across it. It was possible. But the weight load per crossing needed to be managed carefully, and heavier units needed to move more slowly and further apart to avoid load concentrating on weak points in the surface. 3 units needed to move through a narrow, load-sensitive traverse in under 40 minutes to make the objective window. The senior cadets present, the 2 highest threat classification cadets, one from my unit and one from the 3rd unit, were in the process of establishing a crossing sequence when Sable Oren said something. She said it to Gorakshen, not to the group, short. I was close enough to hear it but not close enough to catch the words. Gorakshen turned to look at her. Their assessment posture shifted. Then Gorakshen said, at a volume the full group could hear, "Listen to her." In 3 words. Everyone listened. Sable Oren said, "The surface load analysis is wrong. The narrow traverse isn't the problem. The anchor points at the beginning and end of the traverse are the problem. Those are where the surface stress is concentrating, not in the middle. If we cross in groups of 2 with 10 seconds of separation, we are not distributing the load correctly. We are concentrating it at the same anchor points 20 times in sequence. We need to vary the crossing start points. There are 3 viable alternate start points along the upper face. I can show you where they are. If we stagger entry across all 3 start points in the order I'll give you, we can move 12 cadets across simultaneously with better load distribution than the sequential 2x2 approach. That gets all 3 units across in 22 minutes instead of 41. There was a silence. Then the senior cadet from my unit said, "Show us." She showed us. We crossed in 22 minutes. We made the objective window. Day 21. The last day scenario ended at 1700. The signal went out, the scenario and tone, which is a specific harmonic that H.Ren Valor uses and which I still hear in memory with complete clarity. And the 880 cadets who had completed the assessment were in the field, in their units, in whatever state the last 21 days had left them in, and the assessment was over. The primary yard was the collection point. We came in from all sectors over the course of an hour, arriving in unit clusters in various states of physical composition. My unit arrived midway through the collection period. We stood in the yard and watched the rest of the cohort come in. Unit 12 came in near the end. They walked into the primary yard in the formation they had developed over 21 days, Sable Orin in front, Gorak Shen behind her left, Shen Asen and Rav Teal behind them. They were dirty and tired and intact, all four of them. They had completed. The yard was full. 880 cadets from 31 species, standing in the gray-violet early evening light. The sound was low, the quiet hum of a large group of exhausted beings that haven't quite processed yet that the thing they were doing is finished. Gorak Shen stopped at the edge of the yard's central space. Sable Orin stopped beside them. Then Gorak Shen turned to face the yard. All 412 kilograms of them, turning to face 880 cadets, and the hum in the yard became something quieter. They reached out with their primary upper limb. They placed their hand, the Vethoron primary hand, which is a significant object in the physical sense, on Sable Orin's shoulder. She was 51 kilograms and 1.57 meters, and the hand was large enough that it covered most of her shoulder and upper arm. Then Gorak Shen said 3 words in Vethoron. Their voice was low. The Vethoron pitch register sits below most species' standard hearing bands, and what you perceive in the upper frequencies is more vibration than sound. But it was quiet in the yard, and the words carried. I know some Vethoron, not fluently. Enough. The 3 words were Kethoran Vashen Hail. I should explain. Kethoran is a Vethoron term that does not translate cleanly into any language I know. The closest I can approximate it in Standard Concord is, of the known ground. It describes a being who knows the terrain they inhabit, not in the abstract sense of having studied it, but in the deep instinctive sense of being native to the read of it, of belonging to the information the ground provides. The Vethoron apply it to themselves, and historically to very few other species. It is not a compliment in the way that compliments work in most social frameworks. It is a classification. It means, this one reads the hunt correctly. Vashen is a spatial and relational marker. It means something like, standing with or beside the one who is. It is used in Vethoron relational vocabulary to indicate a specific kind of adjacency, not proximity, not friendship in the common sense, but a bonded positioning. The one who stands Vashen is the one you keep in your awareness not as a threat but as a reference point, as a coordinate. Hail is the word I translated, at the beginning of this account, as little brother. This is not a perfect translation. Hail does not carry the sibling meaning that brother carries in most human frameworks, and it does not carry the diminutive condescension that little carries in most contexts where size hierarchies matter. In Vethoron relational vocabulary, Hail is what you call the member of your pack unit who is smaller than you, faster than you in ways you are not fast, and whose survival you have decided matters to you not because you were instructed to protect them, but because you assessed them and made a choice. Hail means I see what you are, I have classified it, you are mine to stand beside. The Vethoron do not say this easily. They do not say it in public. They do not say it at the end of an endurance assessment in front of 880 cadets, and a faculty observation post, and the entire social structure of HFY Valor Military Academy, unless they mean it in the fullest possible sense of everything that word contains. The yard was completely silent. I don't know what Sable Orin understood of what had been said. I learned later that she had some Vethoron. She'd been studying it since the night Gorak Shen first sat at her table. But in the moment, what she did was, she looked up at Gorak Shen. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she said something, one word in Vethoron, and even at the time I understood it, and she put her hand over the place where Gorakshen's hand rested on her shoulder. She said, "Hail. There is a formal Vethoron protocol for how you respond when the designation is returned." Gorakshen observed it. They lowered their hand from her shoulder. They inclined their head at an angle that, in Vethoron body language, expresses something that I can only approximate as acknowledged. The classification stands. Then they moved apart, not away from each other, just out of the specific configuration, and the moment was over. Or rather, the moment became an aftermath. The silence in the yard lasted another 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then someone, I don't know who, I don't know which species, I never found out, made a sound. It was not laughter. The ambient amusement of the first week, the low-level involuntary exhale of 51 kilograms at a military academy, that was not the sound. The sound was quieter than that, and more complicated. I don't have a word for it in Keth Valoran or in Concord Standard. I think it was the sound of 880 cadets simultaneously revising a calculation they had been running for 24 days. We were debriefed in unit groups the following morning. My unit's debrief was standard, performance metrics, objective completion, areas of development. I sat in the briefing room with Asen Vale and Veth Ashen and Rak Tevin, and we went through the assessment with our assigned faculty member, and it was fine, and it was over in an hour. I don't know what Unit 12's debrief contained. I was not there. I know that when we came out of our briefing into the corridor, Shen Asen was waiting for Rav Teal, and I asked him, because we had talked during the assessment and I felt I asked him, what had it been like inside Unit 12? He thought about this for a moment. Shen Asen was a Veth Kaloran, and his species takes precision seriously, and I could see him selecting the right words. He said, "On the 4th day I stopped being surprised by the things she knew. On the 7th day I stopped thinking about her size. On the 12th day I understood why Gorakshen had sat down at her table. By the 18th day I was trying to do what she did. I am still not sure what to call what she does. I don't have a word for it in my language. I suspect the correct word is a Vethoron word." I asked which one. He said Kethoran. I served with Gorakshen twice in the 11 years after Atren Valor. Both times I had occasion to ask about Sable Orin, circumspectly, because you are circumspect with Gorakshen not out of fear, but out of respect for the way they hold information. The Vethoron do not discuss their Hale relationships casually. The second time I asked, Gorakshen said, "She is with the 3rd Survey Division. She maps terrain that hasn't been mapped." A pause in which I waited. Then, the kind of terrain where the maps are wrong, where the ground says something different from what the instruments say. They looked at me in the particular way that means, I am finished speaking about this. I did not ask again. But I thought about it afterward, the way I always thought about Atren Valor. About the front row of the intake formation and the small figure that had stood there with complete stillness. About the 5th day in the wreck and the crouched down, stone reading assessment that had taken Atren Osiv to the right place when his sensors could not. About the ridge face on day 18 and the load calculation and 22 minutes instead of 41. About the primer's 4 paragraphs and the word moderate. I have read a great deal about human evolutionary history since then. I have read about what the species spent several million years doing before they built anything that the conquered would classify as civilization. I have read about the kind of land they learned to read, and the things they learned to read it for, and the reasons that a being of 1.57 meters and 51 kilograms would develop, over geological time, the specific and extraordinary ability to look at ground and understand it. The primer, 11 years later, has been updated. The section on humans is now considerably longer than 4 paragraphs. The word moderate appears less frequently. And in the Vethoron records, which are not a document type that updates quickly, and which do not include the kind of cross-species recognition that Hale constitutes, except in cases that the Vethoron collective assessment has determined to warrant inclusion. In those records, there is an entry. The date is the last day of our intake endurance assessment. The entry is short. It reads in Vethoron, Kethoran, Vashen, Hale. And beside it a name, Sable Orin, Human, Earth, 51 kilograms. The records do not include her height. The Vethoron, it turns out, do not classify by height. And,